This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 57.
Excuse me. Mommy and I want to wish you happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Rugula Patugula.
We love
We love
you.
you.
Thank you for birthing me.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
On that note, to start today's episode, Maciej from Poland asks, is introversion / extroversion connected with D4DR, or is the dopamine signaling not related to them?
Great technical question that's actually of a great deal of general importance. Introversion, extroversion, we all have an intuition as to what that's about. Extroversion, you derive most of your sense of stimulation from the world around you, versus introversion from your internal life. So, dopamine D4 receptor. First off, what we're dealing here with is neurotransmitter dopamine. All sorts of you know this by now ad nauseum. What does dopamine do? Classic outdated picture. It's involved in pleasure and reward, next generation insight. It's involved in the anticipation of pleasure and reward, more contemporary version. It's involved in the goal-directed behavior, the motivation, the work you're willing to do in order to get a reward. Okay, so that's dopamine. And it's already known dopamine has something to do with extroversion, introversion differences. There's a relatively well-established literature, for example, showing for the same stimulus, extroverts release more dopamine in the quote reward pathways, the mesolimbic dopamine pathways. Extroverts release more dopamine and or show more sensitivity to dopamine. But what was being asked was not so much about dopamine as dopamine receptors. Dopamine gets released from dopaminergic neurons, dumped from the axon terminal, goes floating across the synapse and binds to receptors, dopamine receptors. And once they bind, something happens in the next neuron. You've passed along the message. And what's implicit in that question is there's a whole family of different types of dopamine receptors, and they have different functions. Dopamine receptor D1 in this part of the brain, dopamine binds to it and it causes these neurons to become very, very excited for a short period. Dopamine D2 is found over in this part of the brain, and you bind dopamine there and the neurons become inhibited just a little, but for a very long time. The different receptors mediating different functions. Okay, so we're focusing in on one of these receptors, the dopamine D4 receptor. And the notion is different variants of it are associated with different aspects of personality and behavior. Variants. Okay, everybody's got a dopamine D4 receptor gene that codes for the dopamine D4 receptor protein doing its thing, but from one person to the next, there can be small individual differences. A gene is made up of the DNA code, a long sequence of base pairs. And what you'll see is in a subset of people, base pair number 273, instead of having this letter of the alphabet, has that letter. Variants of that sort scattered all over the place in the gene, producing variations in the amino acid sequence that makes up the protein. So that amino acid 11D, instead of this type, you have that type instead. And the receptor works a little bit differently, a little more of this, a little bit less of that. So within the one class of dopamine D4 receptors, there's lots of individual variants. So what people have known for some time is some of the D4 variants are associated with things like ADHD and sensation seeking and novelty seeking and being adrenaline junkies. And hopefully you note the misnomer here and that it has nothing to do with adrenaline. It's dopamine in this case, but there's a broad association between different subtypes, different versions of the dopamine D4 receptor and sensation seeking, novelty seeking, things in that realm. Now, that's given rise to one of my all-time favorite studies. This came out of the lab of Kenneth Kidd at Yale some years ago, looking at our last 100,000 years as a species. And when 60, 80,000 years ago, humans migrated out of Africa in either one wave or multiple, still contested. And at that point, some people didn't migrate at all. They stayed in Africa. Some people migrated only as far as the Middle East. Others migrated further to Western Europe and to Eurasia. Some people got even further to East Asia. Some people decided to cross the Bering Straits and go down the Americas all the way down to the tip. In other words, over these tens of thousands of years, different indigenous populations have histories of different lengths of migration, ranging from the folks who hardly migrated at all in Africa to the folks who wound up in like the tip of Tierra del Fuego, is shown right there, and noting something interesting, which is the D4 receptor variant that is most associated with novelty seeking, sensation seeking. The further a population historically migrated, the higher the incidence of that variant. Totally cool. What's that telling you? Have one version of it, and I don't know, you make your way to Siberia and decide this is great. We could settle down here and great place to raise kids. But if you have the sensation seeking, novelty seeking variant, you're more likely at that point to have said 20,000 years ago, ooh, do you see this land bridge going to that place we're going to call Alaska? Let's go check it out. And further, my thousands of miles down the Americas. So there's a correlation between the prevalence of the sensation-seeking, novelty-seeking variant of this dopamine D4 gene and how far your ancestors migrated from out of Africa. So that's totally cool. One additional finding, which taps into some of the cultural stuff we've talked about, there's an exception to this. You look at the trajectories of migration coming out of Africa to Europe, to Eurasia, to East Asia. You look in Southeast Asia, and what you see is extraordinarily low incidence of the novelty-seeking version of the D4 receptor. I mean, not just it wasn't selected for in these people who went further, actively selected against. Very strong jargon, negative selection. And what's the interpretation of this? This is thought to be co-varied, co-evolved with sort of collectivist cultures that dominate Southeast Asia, where the group as a whole is far more important than the individual, and people are unlikely to suddenly get ants in the pants and say, I'm off to go discover the new world. Okay, so that gives us a sense of D4 variants associated with novelty seeking, novel experiences, ADHD, which brings us back to this question, what about introversion, extroversion? And you better bet we already know the answer to this, which is, well, there's kind of some evidence that the more sensation-seeking variants are associated more with extroverted personalities. Some studies have shown that, some have not. There was one nice study looking at Russian populations and showing one variant of the D4 receptor was associated with extroversion. Another variant was not. European population showing the same thing. There was one cool study showing that one variant of the D4 receptor was associated with more extroversion if and only if you lived in a challenging climate, which is to say, have this gene sequence and you're more likely than chance to be extroverted if you live in Kamchatka than if you live in Palo Alto. Classic gene environment interactions. Nonetheless, amid that, some studies have said yes, some have said no. Meta-analyses have been sort of uncommitted. And this actually isn't all that surprising, because when you think about it, extroversion and novelty seeking are not synonymous. There's some people who have an evening, and what's their idea of great pleasure? Sitting alone and reading a book. There's some people, free evening, what's pleasurable? Get together with a bunch of their friends where they sit and they play their 4,000th Settler of Catan game, which does not involve a whole lot of novelty seeking. So Extroversion and novelty seeking are not synonymous, which probably explains why there's only a partial overlap, amid there being some intuitive logic as to why they should be vaguely related. Okay, so that's somewhat of a genetic influence on it, but one final proviso there, take the D4 receptor gene, take all the other usual suspect genes that have anything to do with personality, and look at all the different variants and run all those variants against introversion, extroversion, and how much predictive power do you have knowing about this person's makeup of these candidate genes. And what the studies show is it gives you about 12% predictability, which tells you, number one, there's lots more genes involved that nobody has discovered. Number two, all sorts of environments that have not been appreciated yet. And number three, gene environment interactions. So there's a connection. It's interesting. It's officially intriguing, and worthy of more research. Not all that clear at this point.
All right, next, Cashel says, are there drugs which make people appear dead, as in stories like Romeo and Juliet and others? If yes, what happens in their body after taking the drug?
You betcha, Cashel. The Elizabethans called these sleeping draughts, which were chemicals, typically plant derived, that could put somebody into a deep coma. A deep coma, which is very hard, as we heard some weeks ago, to tell the difference, if you haven't invented things like stethoscopes yet, to tell the difference between someone who's alive, who is breathing once a minute, whose heart is beating 5 times a minute, and someone who's actually dead. So there's a long history of, whoa, we thought you were dead. No, I was actually comatose. So that comes into Romeo and Juliet, as everyone knows, who looked at how much Claire Danes was repelled by Leonardo DiCaprio, or we could talk about the Zeffirelli version, which mommy is obsessed with. But we know at the end, the star-crossed lovers, she takes a sleeping draught that makes it look as if she's dead. He finds her, thinks she's dead, but she's going to wake up soon and they can run away together and live happily ever after. And bereaved, he kills himself just in time for her to wake up and see what happens, and she does it, and there we have the tragedy. So is that real? There were actually plant compounds that were used at the time that we have heard of. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, which is a family of plants, weirdly, which also includes things like tomatoes and potatoes and eggplants, which are the non-toxic versions. But deadly nightshade mainly has this constituent called atropine, and it puts you into a comatose state where it could be mistaken. So that was for real. That was something that was known then, and I don't know how often it was actually used in real life versus in some mystery novel or some such thing, but that's belladonna. However, this whole issue of people who kind of seem like they're dead, but it turns out they aren't, brings me to one of my favorite all-time topics. Once long ago, we talked about the zombie apocalypse, but at long last, we could talk about zombies as a scientific phenomenon. Zombies. Zombies in traditional Haitian voodoo religion, zombies are people who have died and are brought back from the dead. Some elaborations on this. Zombies are people who have actually been killed, poisoned by a witch doctor. The term there is Bokor, except it seemed to have a rolled R in a way I can't replicate. But you have this witch doctor who poisons somebody, puts them into a deep comatose state so that they're mistaken for being dead. They are buried, and that night, the witch doctor and buddies come and unearth the person and pull him out and slap him around until he comes to. And he is now officially a zombie slave, lacking any free will. All of us, but especially the zombie, lacking free will or any agency. He is now made to work as a slave, classically on a plantation. So that's sort of zombification in voodoo religion. And many stories about it. So we have 3 questions at this point. Is this thing for real? And of course, the Western view was, this is nonsense until about 40 years ago, it was proven that there was someone who had been made into a zombie. It was this Haitian guy named Narcisse. And what he did was get himself poisoned by a witch doctor in 1962. He wound up in a hospital, fatigue, spitting up blood. Eventually, he dies, and they bury him in the hospital graveyard. And critical to this, critical in terms of ethnocentrism, is the doctors were American at an Albert Schweitzer hospital. So we know they really knew what they were doing, and they knew if he was dead or not. And they said he was dead, and he signed the forms, and he was buried out there. And then in 1980, 18 years later, he shows up in his hometown where his family instantly recognizes them, and he's able to prove that he's him, knowing stories from their childhood, nicknames, whatever that only he would know. And he's been a zombie. He's been a zombie. What was that about? He was zombified, and then he was unearthed from his grave at this Schweitzer hospital by a Bokor, who then kept him as a slave laborer on a plantation for 2 years afterward. Totally amazing. And we know it's true because it was American doctors who know how to tell if somebody's dead, except turned out he wasn't dead. Okay, so first thing there being, this was the first documented evidence for zombieism. How common is that? The presumption is the vast majority of the time, the people who were intent on digging the person up don't get there in time. The person actually dies. They've suffocated, whatever. So few and far between, but this was a first documented case. So the next question is, what are these Bokors doing to these people to induce this comatose zombified state? And here's where we had one of these swashbuckling heroes of ethnobotany, a guy named Wade Davis, who was actually a classmate of mine, who came in and tried to study what this was about and came up with a very appealing theory as to what was the critical drug being used by these Bokors to induce the zombified state. And what he claimed, what he identified, was a drug called tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin, you always learn about it in intro pharmacology. What it does is it blocks sodium channels. And if you do that, you're going to have a very messed up nervous system. Tetrodotoxin, where does it come from? Number of sources, but most famously from a type of fish called the fugu fish. And tetrodotoxin is in its glands and liver and eyeballs and skin and such. And if you eat a tiny amount of tetrodotoxin with your fugu fish, you get a slight buzz. And remarkably, in Japan, this is a major delicacy to go get some fugu fish that has a little bit of tetrodotoxin in it. And thank God, what you discover is your fugu chef in Japan undergoes 3 years of training to make sure they actually get the right amount out. And I don't know, every now and then they mess up. There was a wonderful episode of The Simpsons where they go to a Japanese restaurant wanting to get some variety in their diet, and Homer, of course, eats some gigantic fugu fish before it could be uncleaned, and he dies from it, seemingly, but not before this hilarious 30 seconds where he goes through the 5 stages of death and dying. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did that dabbed denial, anger, depression, despair, bargaining. Oh, bargaining comes before the despair. And then finally, if you're lucky, acceptance. So he goes through all the stages of that in about 30 seconds. So fugu fish, Japan, you eat fugu fish, you intake a little more tetrodotoxin than was good for you. You go into a coma, they get you out the other end, and you sue the hell out of the restaurant. In Haiti, according to Wade Davis, this was a concoction that Bokors would get puffer fish like these, fugu fish, and extract tetrodotoxin from their glands. They clearly made a whole non-specific gamish of toad's eyes and newt's antlers and who knows what poisoned frog stuff, and made this whole mix, which would then be somehow fed to the soon-to-be victim, put on his doorway so that the person barefoot would walk on it and absorb some of it and such. And Davis argued that zombification was caused by tetrodotoxin. And he brought back some actual like zombie powders from some of these folks, and he had various labs test them to see if there was tetrodotoxin. And the official result was, well, some of them don't have any, and a few of them have a little, but we really don't know what counts as a little. But this one definitely doesn't have. And what's happened over the years is the tetrodotoxin sort of theory has taken somewhat of a backseat. Along the way, though, Davis had a dream come true for any graduate student, in that his doctoral thesis was made into a crappy drive-in B-movie horror movie called The Serpent and the Rainbow about zombies. Grad students would kill to do this instead of feeling like they've become zombies over the course of their 4 to 6 years. So that has lost some currency, but the assumption is in these rare cases, Clairvius narcisse, it was some combination of stuff that induced a coma in him. And he survived and they dug him up. So that brings up the final question, which is he worked on this plantation as a zombie slave for years. And the dogma is the zombie master. Yes, you can even be a zombie master on one of these plantations. The zombie master would feed the slaves, and there would be a whole bunch of them, would feed them some other drug that would zap them of their will. And there's been some argument that it's this plant called datura, which has some hallucinogenic properties, but the evidence for that is even weaker. Nonetheless, at least in this one documented case, he spent a number of years there, willingly being a zombie, if he wasn't actually being pharmacologically turned into that, seemingly long after the tetrodotoxin or whatever it was had cleared. Months, seasons later, he was still willingly working on this plantation. What's that about? And here's where some really interesting cultural stuff comes in. Who gets turned into a zombie? Bad people, norm violators, antisocial jerks who are bad people and antisocial jerks on a big scale, big enough of a scale that it takes a whole bunch of people in the community to come together and reach consensus that this guy needs to be zombified so that they could pool money enough to hire the witch doctor who's crazy expensive and doesn't take insurance. And what we have is a great consensual mechanism if and only if a large percentage of your community thinks you were such an awful person that they're willing to pool their money to get you zombified. That's a pretty good sign that you are sort of dead to them. And what that suggests is this takes on somewhat of a literal feel. Somewhat like Narcisse. Narcisse, for example, apparently was a wife beater, and he stole his brother's widow's life savings, and he abandoned his kids, and he was like a totally rotten human, apparently. And showing how much this is part of the story, his zombie master died 2 years into Narcisse being a zombified slave, and thus he became free. And he waited, nonetheless, more than 15 more years before going back to his home village, because people there wanted him dead. And sort of as the best sign of it, he showed back, and there's a sister, she hasn't seen him in decades, and she says, "Oh, so you were a zombie, you're still a jerk, get out of here." And I think what we see here is a pharmacological insight that does or does not involve tetrodotoxin and other neurochemicals. And in the context of making sense of that in a Japanese restaurant versus in Haiti, we see all the additional cultural trappings, so that if you wake up being dug out of a grave, out of a coffin in Haiti, it means everyone back home wants you to be dead or wants you to be a zombie. You're as good as dead to them. And that makes a wonderful point. This anthropologist named Nigel Barley, who wrote a great bizarrely funny book called Grave Matters, a whole tour of attitudes towards the dead and the undead and all that throughout the world, different cultures, making a very important point. In lots of cultures, the dead continue to have very active roles in everyone else's everyday lives. And in other cultures, living people are just as well as dead for how they're treated, cultural context. So that's the story of zombies, and I suspect that does not apply to Romeo and Juliet, but nonetheless.
It's always occurred to me that in some ways this serves as sort of a culture's choice of an alternative to a formalized death penalty.
Yes. And in a very similar way, anthropologist named Christopher Bohm at USC or UCLA has studied all sorts of hunter-gatherer pastoralist societies, particular Inuit, way the hell up north somewhere. And there's a mechanism. If somebody's doing something bad, they get yelled at. If something's doing something really bad, they get ostracized, they get exiled, or if they're really so awful, everybody pools a lot of resources to hire someone to convince one of their group to go about killing the person. So group consensus, community consensus, that's the exact same mechanism.
Finally, Lyndon from Canada says, I have been an alcoholic since I was old enough to buy booze, as was my father. I'm an atheist, and so I'm not interested in AA or other programs like that. Do you have any suggestions for a person like me to help stop me from drinking?
Well, I have a very clear suggestion, which is going to be of very little use given your question. But first off, Lyndon, sorry to hear your struggles with this disease. It is one of the more awful ways that your biology can ambush you and wreak havoc with your life, destroy it potentially. What we know at this point is alcoholism predictably reflects in part genes and in part early experience, beginning in fetal life and cultural aspects. And collectively, we get a subset of individuals who are profoundly vulnerable to addictive substance abuse. Now, what you're bringing up is one of the more effective things that people do, which is to go to something like AA or Narcotics Anonymous, NA. And what everybody in that field, which I'm only slightly familiar with, what they all say is, yeah, AA is actually one of the most effective things out there. And the problem where the bone sticks in your craw is the fact that AA, NA, programs like that are very religiously based. And you're an atheist, and this isn't working for you. So let's unpack that a little bit and look at why is religiosity good for your health as framed here, recovering from substance abuse, learning to manage it, getting better from that. Why is religiosity good for your health? And there's been a literature around for decades and decades showing religious people live longer and they've got less heart disease. And this has been like a mainstay of one whole realm of sort of behavioral medicine. And it comes with all sorts of confounds. First off, it's not random who chooses to spend their life being religious or otherwise. So there's a self-selection component. Next, religiosity typically involves a healthier lifestyle. And whether that's eating, shepherd's pie at the church picnic on Sundays or less substance abuse, that's another factor also. But probably the biggest factor is that with few exceptions, what religiosity means is you also get a community of like-minded people, of co-religionists. And when you do careful studies comparing religious people and you see how often, how intensely are they involved in their religious community, and find atheists who are just as involved in their own humanist community, you don't see a difference in health, showing that what this is mostly about is you get a community. And community can do wonderful things in the context of religion. Community can do terrible things. A fascinating study some years ago looking in the Middle East and Northern Ireland, and I think the Basque country, and looking for the relationships with people's religiosity there, how religious they were, and how likely they were to participate and to condone some sort of religious terrorism. And what everyone expected was, okay, how often did you go to prayer and how intensely did you feel it? And that turned out not to be the predictor. The key predictor, and this was most studied in the Middle East, but the key predictor was not how often you prayed, how often you prayed in a mosque, how often you prayed surrounded by your co-religionists, people who feel like you, people who believe people who would kill for you, die for you. So for better or worse, community is a really powerful thing in terms of religiosity. And this is where so many atheists wind up being like these pickled cranks, because, me included, because so much of what atheism is about is what you don't believe in. You don't believe in God. You don't believe in Easter bunnies. You don't believe in Dybbuk. You don't believe in whatever it is. And a movement that's emerged in recent decades of trying to say what it is that people who are atheists do believe in. And this has been termed the humanism movement. And its organizing principle is the notion of, where does human goodness come from? It comes from humans, not from above, not from some sort of deity's decree, but humans are the source of human goodness. So framed in that way, if you can get yourself a humanist community of people who are trying to stop abusing alcohol, as you suggested, up in northern Canada, few and far between. But where I suggest something that's totally like counter to what you brought up is, maybe you should think about AA again, because look at what's working there. It doesn't really matter somebody's theological system when people unpack sort of the health benefits of religiosity. It's mostly about community. And just to sound snarky and pejorative, in a sense, it doesn't matter what gibberish people around you are saying and believing, if that's the pathway by which they get a hold of their lives and the pathway by which they care about you and watch out for you and help you to do the same. So just to be even more snarky, maybe you need to hold your nose and shut your eyes and go there, and instead of going for the trappings, go for the content. This is a community of people who've struggled with the same things you have, and they are there for you, and you are expected to be there for them. And it doesn't really matter what kind of frosting you put on top of that.
And that's episode 57. Keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.